The evening had started with such promise. Jaiwoo adjusted her designer dress one final time before entering the upscale restaurant in Gangnam, her heart fluttering with anticipation. She had received a mysterious text from her fiancé, Hyunwoo, earlier that day, asking her to meet him at their favorite restaurant. The place held special meaning. It was where they had celebrated their engagement just 8 months ago. And if you want a handsome CEO in your life and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The maitre d' led her through the dimly lit space, weaving between tables of well-dressed patrons. As she approached the back of the restaurant, she noticed Hyunwoo's familiar silhouette. But something was off. He wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him, their heads close together, hands intertwined on the white tablecloth. Jaiwoo stopped dead in her tracks. The world seemed to tilt sideways as she watched Hyunwoo lean forward and kiss the woman's hand. The gesture was intimate, familiar, the same way he used to kiss her hand. She stood frozen, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. The maitre d' continued walking for a few steps before realizing she had stopped. "Ma'am?" he asked, turning back with concern. His voice broke the spell. Jaiwoo's legs carried her forward, without conscious thought. Hyunwoo looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, his expression shifting from contentment to shock as he registered her presence. The woman turned too, revealing a face Jaiwoo recognized, Seo-yeon, Hyunwoo's colleague from the architecture firm. "Jaiwoo," Hyunwoo started, quickly pulling his hands away. "This isn't... I can explain." But there was nothing to explain. The truth sat before her in crystal clarity. The intimate dinner setting, their clasped hands, the guilty look on both their faces. Jaiwoo's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the color draining from her face. "How long?" The words came out barely above a whisper. When Hyunwoo hesitated, Seo-yeon spoke up, her voice steady. 3 months. 3 months. While Jaiwoo had been planning their wedding, choosing flowers and tasting cakes, her fiancé had been falling in love with someone else. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The next morning found Jaiwoo in her apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of her life plans. Design portfolios and wedding magazines lay scattered across the floor, mocking reminders of her shattered dreams. She sat amid moving boxes. She'd spent the night packing up everything that reminded her of Hyunwoo, working through tears until exhaustion forced her to stop. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from concerned friends and family who had heard the news. She ignored them all. The only person she responded to was her best friend, Min-ji, who refused to leave her alone in this state. "You need to get out of this apartment," Min-ji insisted during her 3rd visit that week. She picked up a portfolio from the floor, one of Jaiwoo's most ambitious interior design projects. "These are too good to be collecting dust while you hide from the world." Jaiwoo barely looked up from her position on the couch. "What's the point? I was going to open my own studio after the wedding. Hyunwoo was going to help with the business side." Min-ji sat down beside her, holding up the portfolio. "The point is that you're talented, with or without him. Look at this design for the community center. It's innovative, thoughtful, exactly what the industry needs right now." She paused, then pulled out her phone. "There's a design fair in Busan next month. I've already checked. They're still accepting applications for exhibitors." Busan. Jaiwoo scoffed. "That's halfway across the country." "Exactly. Far enough from here to give you a fresh start. Remember when we were in design school? You always said you wanted to make spaces that could heal people. Well, maybe it's time to heal yourself first." The words struck a chord. Jaiwoo looked around her apartment, at the half-packed boxes, the scattered remnants of her old life. Her gaze landed on her drafting table by the window, where sunlight illuminated her latest sketches. Even in her darkest moments, she hadn't been able to stop creating, imagining new spaces that could transform lives. Min-ji watched the subtle shift in her friend's expression and pressed her advantage. "I'll help you prepare the exhibition materials. We can make this happen." For the first time in weeks, Jaiwoo felt a tiny spark of something that felt like hope. She reached for the portfolio Min-ji held, running her fingers over the designs she had poured her heart into. Maybe her friend was right. Maybe she needed to stop defining herself by what she had lost and start focusing on what she could still create. "Okay," she said finally, her voice rough but determined. "Help me apply for the fair." The decision marked a turning point. Over the next few weeks, Jaiwoo threw herself into preparing for the exhibition. Every hour spent selecting projects and refining presentations was an hour she didn't spend thinking about Hyunwoo. Her apartment slowly transformed from a shrine to her failed relationship into a workshop for her future. The Busan International Design Fair buzzed with energy as designers, architects, and industry professionals filled the expansive convention center. Jaiwoo stood at her booth, making final adjustments to her display. The past month of preparation had transformed her portfolio into a professional exhibition showcasing her vision for community center design. Her presentation focused on transforming ordinary spaces into environments that promoted healing and connection. The centerpiece was her community center design, featuring innovative use of natural light and modular spaces that could adapt to different community needs. She had spent countless nights perfecting every detail, channeling her pain into creativity. "Your use of vertical space is fascinating," a deep voice commented in perfect Korean. Jaiwoo turned to find a tall man studying her blueprints with genuine interest. He wore a well-tailored suit that suggested success, but his expression held none of the condescension she'd encountered from other executives during the fair. "I'm Min Jae," he introduced himself, extending a business card with both hands in traditional Korean fashion. "CEO of Urban Revival Projects." The card confirmed his position at one of Seoul's most progressive development companies, known for their commitment to sustainable urban renewal. Jaiwoo accepted the card with a slight bow, noticing how his eyes remained fixed on her designs rather than on her. "The vertical gardens integrate with the building's water recycling system," she explained, pointing to the relevant sections of her blueprint. "It reduces energy costs while creating green spaces accessible to all residents, including those with mobility issues," Min Jae noted, tracing the ramp system with his finger. "You've thought about everyone." Their conversation deepened as Jaiwoo walked him through her other projects. Min Jae asked intelligent questions that revealed both his technical knowledge and his genuine interest in community impact. She found herself relaxing into the discussion, her passion for design overshadowing her usual reserve with strangers. "We should continue this conversation in a more official setting," Min Jae said after nearly an hour. "My company is starting a major revitalization project in one of Busan's oldest neighborhoods. Would you be interested in presenting your ideas to our board?" The opportunity was unexpected but exciting. Yet Jaiwoo hesitated, memories of her last professional partnership with Hyunwoo making her wary. Min Jae seemed to sense her reluctance. "Take your time to think about it," he said, adding his personal number to the business card he'd given her. "The neighborhood has been my mother's home for 40 years. It deserves someone who understands that buildings are more than just structures. They're the framework for people's lives." Later that evening, in her hotel room, Jaiwoo researched urban revival projects extensively. Their past projects showed a consistent pattern of respecting local communities while modernizing outdated spaces. The company's philosophy aligned perfectly with her own vision of design as a tool for social good. The next morning, she called Min Jae and accepted his invitation to present to the board. He scheduled the meeting for the following week, giving her time to prepare a detailed proposal. As she worked on the presentation, Jaiwoo found herself thinking less about proving herself and more about the potential impact she could have on the community. The day of the presentation, Min Jae met her in the lobby of a sleek office building overlooking Busan's harbor. "Ready?" he asked, noticing her grip tight on her portfolio. "Ready," she confirmed, surprising herself by meaning it. The boardroom contained only 5 people, a deliberately small group, Min Jae explained, to ensure focused discussion. As Jaiwoo presented her vision for the neighborhood's revival, she noticed how Min Jae's presence seemed to give weight to her words. He asked questions that highlighted the strongest aspects of her proposal, showing a level of professional respect she hadn't experienced before. The project would take approximately 18 months, she concluded, with minimal disruption to current residents. Each phase is designed to improve their daily lives immediately, not just after completion. A thoughtful silence followed her presentation. Then the board's senior member, an elderly man with kind eyes, spoke up. "Mr. Park," he addressed Min Jae, Your mother would approve of this approach. Minji's expression softened at the mention of his mother. She would, he agreed quietly. Turning to Jaiwoo, he added, "Would you be interested in leading this project?" The offer was more than just a job opportunity. It was a chance to prove that she could succeed on her own terms. Still, she made herself consider it carefully, determined not to let emotion drive her decision. "I have one condition," she said finally. "I want to meet the residents before making any final designs. I need to understand their needs firsthand." Minji's smile suggested she had given exactly the right answer. "How about we start tomorrow? I know all the best local restaurants. We can talk to the residents over proper Busan cuisine." For the first time in months, Jaiwoo felt truly excited about the future. This project represented everything she had dreamed of doing with her designs, creating spaces that made a real difference in people's lives. The fact that she was doing it entirely on her own merit, without riding on anyone else's coattails, made it even more meaningful. Over the following weeks, Jaiwoo and Minjae spent considerable time together, their professional relationship gradually warming into something more personal. During one late evening at the office, as they reviewed design plans over takeout dinner, their conversation drifted away from work. "What brought you to interior design?" Minjae asked, setting aside his chopsticks. The office lights cast a soft glow across the scattered blueprints between them. Jaiwoo paused, considering how to answer. The truth emerged before she could filter it. "I was engaged until recently," she said, her voice steady despite the lingering pain. "I found my fiancé with another woman at our favorite restaurant. He had been seeing her for months while I planned our wedding." Minji's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed understanding. "That must have been difficult," he said simply, without the usual awkward platitudes people offered when hearing about her situation. "It was," she acknowledged, "but somehow, designing spaces became my way of healing. I started thinking about how environments affect emotions, how the right space can help people feel safe and whole again." She gestured to their surroundings. "Like this project, it's not just about making things look better. It's about creating spaces where people can rebuild their lives." Minjae nodded slowly, then shared his own story. "My mother passed away 2 years ago," he revealed, his voice softening. "She raised me alone in this neighborhood. Every morning, she would walk to the local market, greeting everyone by name. She knew every shopkeeper's children, every elderly resident's health concerns." He smiled at the memory. "When developers started buying up properties, she organized the community to resist. That's actually why I started urban revival projects, to prove that development doesn't have to mean displacement." Their shared vulnerabilities created a subtle shift in their dynamic. Jaiwoo found herself seeing Minjae not just as a successful CEO, but as someone who understood loss and transformation as intimately as she did. The next day, they visited the neighborhood together. Unlike their previous professional tours, this visit felt more personal. Minjae introduced her to Mrs. Kim, who had been his mother's best friend, running a small traditional tea shop for 40 years. The elderly woman's eyes lit up as Jaiwoo shared her ideas for preserving the shop's historical character while making it more accessible to younger customers. "You remind me of Minji's mother," Mrs. Kim said warmly, serving them traditional green tea. "She always said that progress shouldn't erase history, but build upon it." As they walked through the narrow streets, Jaiwoo found herself deeply moved by the stories embedded in every corner. A faded playground where Minjae had spent his childhood afternoons. A small shrine where residents still left daily offerings. Each story strengthened her determination to honor the neighborhood's soul while preparing it for the future. Minjae watched her interact with the residents, noting how carefully she listened to their concerns and hopes. But she also noticed something in him, a hesitation whenever conversations turned personal, a careful distance he maintained despite their growing closeness. The truth emerged during another evening at the office. As they reviewed community feedback, Minjae suddenly spoke. "My mother's death changed everything," he said quietly. "She was sick for months, but I was too busy with work to notice. By the time I realized how serious it was." He trailed off, his usual confidence wavering. "That's why this project means so much to you," Jaiwoo realized. It's not just about development. It's about making things right, he confirmed. But sometimes I wonder if I'm worthy of carrying forward her legacy. His vulnerability in that moment struck Jaiwoo deeply. Here was a successful CEO admitting his deepest doubts to her. She reached across the table, briefly touching his hand. "Your mother would be proud," she said firmly. "You're not just preserving buildings, you're preserving the community she loved." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken emotions. Then Min-jae gently withdrew his hand, returning to the blueprints with forced professionalism. Jaiwoo recognized the gesture for what it was: fear of becoming too close, too vulnerable. Their work continued, but something had shifted. Every interaction now carried the weight of their shared confidences and unacknowledged feelings. Jaiwoo found herself looking forward to their meetings, not just for the project's sake, but for the chance to see Minji's rare, genuine smiles. Meanwhile, Minji's professional demeanor would occasionally slip, revealing moments of warmth and care that went beyond business courtesy. The residents noticed too. "He's different when you're around," Mrs. Kim told Jaiwoo during one of their tea sessions. "More like the boy I remember, before all the heaviness set in." But whenever such observations arose, Min-jae would retreat, behind his professional facade, as if afraid to acknowledge the growing connection between them. His mother's death had clearly left deeper scars than he admitted, making him hesitant to risk emotional attachment. The peaceful momentum of the project shattered one morning when an elegant woman in her 60s strode into the office, unannounced. Jaiwoo immediately noticed her expensive handbag and the way staff members bowed deeply as she passed. The woman walked straight to Minji's office, ignoring protocols and secretaries alike. "Mother?" Minji's voice carried through the open door, a mix of surprise and tension. Jaiwoo, working at her desk nearby, couldn't help but overhear. "So this is what you've been doing," his mother said, her voice carrying the weight of disapproval. "Throwing away millions on this old neighborhood when you could be developing luxury apartments in Gangnam." Jaiwoo realized with a start that this was Minji's stepmother, the woman who had married his father shortly after his mother's death. She had heard snippets about her from Mrs. Kim, none of them particularly flattering. "The project is financially sound," Min-jae responded, his voice taking on the careful tone of a CEO rather than a son. "Our projections show significant return on investment while maintaining the community's integrity." Community. His stepmother's laugh was sharp. "You mean those old shops and rundown houses? And who's this designer I keep hearing about?" "Some girl from Busan with no connections." Jaiwoo's hands stilled over her keyboard. She hadn't expected to become a target of the woman's criticism. Through the open door, she could see Minji's face hardening. "Jaiwoo is highly qualified," he said firmly. "Her designs have already received positive attention from several architectural journals." "Qualified isn't enough in our world, Min-jae. You need someone with the right background, the right connections. Like Seo Hyun, you remember her? Her father's company would make an excellent partner for urban revival." The silence that followed felt heavy with implication. Jaiwoo found herself thinking about her own failed engagement, about class differences and social expectations. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her things, deciding to work from home for the rest of the day. But before she could leave, Min-jae appeared at her desk. "Join me for coffee?" he asked, loud enough for his stepmother to hear. His expression carried an apology and something else, defiance. At the cafe across the street, Min-jae spoke first. "I'm sorry you had to hear that. My stepmother has traditional views about business and social status." "She's not entirely wrong," Jaiwoo said quietly. "I don't have connections or family influence. Maybe someone with better credentials would be more suitable for this project." "Stop." Minji's voice was firm. "You understand this neighborhood in a way no high society designer ever could. You see these people as human beings, not just numbers on a spreadsheet." He paused, then added softly, "Just like my mother did." Before Jaiwoo could respond, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen made her blood run cold. Hyunwoo. Her ex-fiancé had been trying to reach her for days, leaving messages about wanting to explain, wanting another chance. Min-jae noticed her expression change. "Everything okay?" "It's nothing," she said quickly, silencing the phone. But the damage was done. The message had shaken her confidence, bringing back memories of inadequacy and betrayal. That evening, alone in her apartment, Jaiwa stared at Hyenwa's messages. "I made a mistake," he wrote. "Seo Yun meant nothing. My parents miss you. We can still make this work." The timing felt cruel. Just when she was finding her footing, her past threatened to pull her under again. She thought about Minji's stepmother, about class differences and social expectations. Maybe she was trying to reach too high, both professionally and personally. But then, she remembered the residents' faces when she presented her designs. Mrs. Kim's approval, Minji's faith in her vision, the way he had stood up to his stepmother. These people believed in her not because of her background, but because of her work, her understanding, her dedication. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Min-jae. "The board loved your latest revisions. You're proving my stepmother wrong with every design. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself." The message carried no romantic undertones, nothing inappropriate for a CEO to send his project leader. Yet it touched something deep in Jaiwa's heart, reinforcing her determination to prove herself worthy of the trust placed in her. She picked up her phone one last time, finally doing what she should have done weeks ago. She blocked Hyenwa's number. Then she turned to her drafting table, where her latest designs waited. The project needed her full attention, and she was done letting ghosts from her past hold her back. The morning after blocking Hyenwa's number, Jaiwoo arrived at the office early, her mind clear and focused. The project had entered a crucial phase, with the first set of renovations scheduled to begin in the historic market area. As she reviewed the construction timeline, she noticed subtle improvements she could make to minimize disruption to the local businesses. Her growing confidence showed in her work. During team meetings, she spoke with authority about her design choices, backing each decision with careful research and community feedback. The junior designers began coming to her for guidance, and she found herself naturally stepping into a mentorship role she hadn't known she could fill. One evening, as she was making final adjustments to the market area plans, Min-jae appeared at her desk. "Are you free tonight?" he asked, his usual professional demeanor softened by what appeared to be nervousness. "I'd like to show you something." He drove them to a small restaurant hidden in one of Busan's older neighborhoods, similar to the one they were working to revitalize. The place was intimate, with traditional floor seating and vintage photographs lining the walls. An elderly woman greeted Min-jae like a son. "This was my mother's favorite restaurant," he explained as they settled at a low table. "She used to bring me here every Sunday after church. The owner, Mrs. Young, taught me how to use chopsticks properly." His smile held both sadness and warmth. "I haven't brought anyone else here before." The significance of this gesture wasn't lost on Jaiwoo. As they shared dishes his mother had loved, Min-jae opened up about his childhood, his voice soft with memories. He spoke about watching his mother fight to preserve their neighborhood's character while other areas succumbed to impersonal development. "She would have loved your designs," he said, reaching across the table to serve Jaiwoo more soup. "Especially how you've incorporated spaces for children to play near the elderly residents' gathering spots. She always said a neighborhood needs all generations to truly live." The intimacy of the moment, the shared food, and Minji's obvious emotional investment created a bubble of warmth around them. But as the evening drew to a close, reality intruded. Minji's phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from his stepmother about an upcoming board meeting with potential investors. "She's arranging dinner with a young family next week," he said, his expression clouding. Their daughter, Seo Hyun, recently returned from studying architecture in New York. "Mother thinks she would be perfect for our company and for me." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Jaiwoo felt her heart constrict, but she kept her voice steady. "And what do you think?" Minji's response was interrupted by Mrs. Young bringing dessert, traditional rice cakes his mother had always ordered. As they shared the sweet treats, Jaiwoo noticed how Minji's shoulders tensed. Never his phone lit up with another message. "Sometimes," he said finally, "I wonder if I'm betraying my mother's memory by allowing my stepmother so much influence in my life. But she and my father were the ones who helped establish urban revival projects. Their connections made everything possible. Jaiwoo considered his words carefully before responding. Your mother fought to preserve what mattered while embracing necessary change. Isn't that exactly what you're doing with this project? Following her example doesn't mean rejecting everything new. Her words seemed to touch something deep in Min-jae. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, might cross the careful professional boundary they'd maintained. Instead, he smiled softly and offered her the last rice cake. The evening ended with a quiet drive back to her apartment. As Jaiwoo prepared for bed that night, she realized something had shifted within her. The pain of Hyunwoo's betrayal felt distant, replaced by a growing understanding of her own worth. Her success with the project wasn't luck or charity. It was the result of her talent, dedication, and genuine connection with the community. Yet she also recognized the complexity of her feelings for Min-jae. What had started as professional admiration had grown into something deeper, something that both thrilled and frightened her. The memory of his smile across the dinner table, the way he shared his mother's story, the gentle way he served her food, all of it spoke to a connection that transcended business. The morning peace of Jaiwoo's office was shattered by an unexpected email. Hyunwoo had written to her work address, bypassing her phone block. The subject line made her stomach drop. Things people should know about you. The message was brief, but clear. If she didn't meet him to talk, he would share details about her family's financial troubles and her father's past business failures with her new colleagues. Her hands trembled as she closed the email. The story Hyunwoo threatened to expose was painfully simple. Her father's small construction company had gone bankrupt when she was in high school, leaving their family in debt. They had spent years rebuilding their lives, working multiple jobs to put her through design school. It wasn't shameful, but in the status-conscious world of corporate South Korea, such history could damage the reputation she'd worked so hard to build. The timing couldn't have been worse. Later that day, she was scheduled to present her most ambitious proposal yet, a complete redesign of the neighborhood's central marketplace. The plan incorporated modern amenities while preserving the traditional character that made the area special. She had worked countless hours on it, consulting with every shop owner and resident. During the presentation, Jaiwoo noticed Min-jae's unusual tension. He sat at the head of the conference table, his expression guarded as she explained the innovative features of her design. The other executives responded enthusiastically, particularly to her solution for maintaining business continuity during construction. But Min-jae remained quiet, his eyes fixed on his stepmother, who watched from the corner with barely concealed disapproval. When the questions began, his stepmother spoke first. "This seems unnecessarily complex," she said, her voice carrying authority earned through years in corporate boardrooms. Traditional redevelopment would be more cost-effective. Clear the area, build new structures, offer the current tenants first right of return at market rates. Jaiwoo felt her professional mask slipping. With respect, that approach would destroy the community. Many of these businesses have operated for generations. They can't afford market rates, and their customers can't follow them to temporary locations. "Business is business," the stepmother replied coldly. "Sentiment has no place in development." Eyes turned to Min-jae, waiting for his response. He cleared his throat, his discomfort visible. "Perhaps we should consider a middle ground. Jaiwoo's design has merit, but we could scale back some of the preservation elements to reduce costs." The compromise might have seemed reasonable to others, but Jaiwoo heard what it really was: fear. Fear of challenging his stepmother, fear of risking the company's relationships with traditional investors, fear of choosing heart over business sense, as his mother once had. After the meeting, Jaiwoo found herself alone with Min-jae in his office. The tension between them was palpable. "You know this is wrong," she said quietly. "Your mother wouldn't have compromised on this." "Don't." His voice was sharp. "Don't use my mother to manipulate me. This is business, Jaiwoo. We have shareholders' responsibilities." The responsibility to protect profit margins over people? She felt tears threatening but forced them back. "I thought you were different. I thought you understood what these spaces mean to people who have nothing else." Min-jae's expression softened slightly. "Of course I understand. But understanding doesn't pay construction costs or satisfy investors. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. Sometimes we have to make hard choices, like choosing suitable marriage partners. The words escaped before she could stop them. His silence was answer enough. Back at her desk, Jaiwa stared at Hyunwoo's threatening email again. She understood now why it had shaken her so deeply, not because she was ashamed of her past, but because she recognized the pattern. Once again, she was being asked to compromise who she was to fit someone else's idea of success. The parallel between her situation and Minji's struck her forcefully. They were both caught between authenticity and expectation, between honoring their true selves and meeting society's demands. But while she had already lost everything once and survived, Min-jae was still trapped in the fear of losing what he had. That evening, alone in her apartment, Jaiwoo made a decision. She opened her laptop and began to work, redesigning her proposal not to appease Minji's stepmother, but to prove that preservation and progress could coexist. She worked through the night, drawing on everything she had learned from the community, everything she understood about the soul of a neighborhood. The next morning, she carried her new designs to the office, prepared to fight for them. She hadn't anticipated falling for Min-jae, hadn't planned on caring so deeply about his approval. But she wouldn't compromise her principles for him any more than she had for Hyunwoo. If her past was exposed, she would face it. If her designs were rejected, she would stand by them anyway. After the tense confrontation with Min-jae, Jaiwa needed to clear her head. She found herself walking through the neighborhood they were working to revitalize, her footsteps carrying her past familiar shops and alleyways. The evening air was heavy with the scent of street food and the sound of residents returning home from work. Outside Mrs. Kim's tea shop, a small crowd had gathered. Curious, Jaiwo approached to find several elderly residents engaged in animated discussion. Mrs. Kim spotted her and waved her over enthusiastically.
기워자.
Perfect timing. We were just talking about your designs for the marketplace. To Jaiwa's surprise, the residents had created a makeshift display using her public presentation materials. Mrs. Kim had posted them in her shop window, and the community had been discussing them all day. An elderly man, whom Jaiwa recognized as the owner of the local hardware store, stepped forward. "My father opened our shop 60 years ago," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "When the big companies started buying up properties, I thought we would have to close. But your design," he gestured to the plans, "it gives us hope. You understand that a neighborhood is more than just buildings." One by one, the residents shared their stories. A young mother explained how the planned community spaces would allow her children to play safely while she worked at her family's restaurant. A retired teacher praised the integration of modern amenities with traditional architecture. Each story reinforced what Jaiwa had always believed, that thoughtful design could preserve the soul of a community while preparing it for the future. As the group dispersed, Mrs. Kim invited Jaiwo in for tea. The shop was quiet now, the evening light casting long shadows through the traditional paper windows. "You remind me so much of Minji's mother," Mrs. Kim said as she prepared the tea. She had the same fire in her eyes when fighting for what she believed in. "I wish I could have met her," Jaiwo replied softly, watching the steam rise from her cup. "She would have loved you," Mrs. Kim said matter-of-factly. "And she would have recognized what I see happening between you and her son." Before Jaiwa could respond, the shop's door chimed. Min-jae stood in the entrance, looking somewhat disheveled, a far cry from his usual polished CEO appearance. His eyes found Jaiwa's, and the vulnerability in his expression made her heart skip. "I've been looking for you," he said quietly. "Can we talk?" Mrs. Kim discreetly disappeared into the back of the shop as Min-jae took a seat across from Jaiwo. For a moment, neither spoke, the only sound the gentle bubbling of the tea kettle. "I spent the afternoon reviewing your original designs again," Min-jae finally said. "And then I walked through the neighborhood, really looking at what you're trying to preserve." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "You were right. About everything. About what my mother would have wanted, about the soul of this place, about me being afraid." Jaiwoo remained silent, allowing him to continue. I've been so focused on proving myself to my stepmother, to the board, to everyone who doubted I could run this company. I almost forgot why I started it in the first place. Your mother's legacy, Jaiwa said softly. Yes, but it's more than that now. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. You've helped me see that it's about the future too. About creating spaces where communities can thrive, where tradition and progress can coexist. The touch of his hand sent warmth through her entire body, but Jaiwa knew they needed to address the larger issue. What about your stepmother? The investors? I've scheduled a board meeting for tomorrow morning, he said, his voice stronger now. I'm going to fight for your design, for this community, for what I believe in. His hand tightened slightly around hers. I'm done letting fear dictate my choices. As if on cue, Mrs. Kim reappeared with fresh tea and a knowing smile. Your mother always said that love gives us courage, she told Min-jae. Perhaps she sent Jaiwa to remind you of that. The moment was interrupted by excited voices outside. The evening news had picked up the story of their project, and a local reporter was interviewing residents about the innovative preservation plans. Through the shop window, they could see people gathering, proudly showing off Jaiwa's designs and sharing their hopes for the neighborhood's future. Min-jae stood, still holding Jaiwa's hand. Come with me tomorrow, he said. Let's present your vision to the board together. No compromises this time. The morning of the board presentation dawned bright and clear. The Urban Revival Project's headquarters buzzed with unusual energy as staff members prepared the main conference room. Jaiwa arrived early, arranging her updated designs and presentation materials with meticulous care. She had spent the night refining every detail, determined to prove that community preservation and financial success could coexist harmoniously. Residents from the neighborhood began arriving, filling the building's lobby with the sounds of excited sea. Conversation. Min-jae had insisted on their presence, wanting the board to see the real people behind the project numbers. Mrs. Kim stood at the center of the group, elegant in her traditional hanbok, a living testament to the culture they were fighting to preserve. The atmosphere shifted when Min-jae's stepmother entered, accompanied by several board members and, notably, a striking young woman whom Jaiwa recognized from social media photos as Seo Hyun, the architect from New York. The stepmother's eyes narrowed at the sight of the residents, clearly disapproving of their presence at what she considered a private business matter. Min-jae arrived last, and Jaiwa noticed immediately that something was different about him. Gone was the careful hesitation that had characterized his recent interactions. He moved with purpose, greeting the residents warmly before addressing the board members with quiet confidence. When his eyes met Jaiwa's, they held steady, unwavering. The presentation began with Min-jae introducing the project's evolution. When we started Urban Revival Projects, he said, his voice clear and strong, we promised to honor the spirit of communities while preparing them for the future. Today, we show you how we're keeping that promise. As Jaiwa presented her designs, she felt a surge of pride in how they had developed. The early sketches had grown into a comprehensive vision that balanced preservation with progress. She explained how each element, from the modernized market stalls to the integrated community spaces, served both cultural and economic purposes. These aren't just buildings, she explained, displaying detailed renderings of the marketplace. They're the foundation of people's livelihoods, their connections, their sense of belonging. By preserving and enhancing these spaces, we create value that goes beyond simple real estate appreciation. The residents added their voices, sharing personal stories that brought the designs to life. Mrs. Kim spoke movingly about how the tea shop had been her family's anchor for generations. A young couple described their dreams of raising children in a neighborhood that remembered its past while embracing its future. Throughout the presentation, Min-jae's stepmother maintained a cold silence, her disapproval evident in every rigid line of her posture. When the time came for questions, she spoke with calculated precision. These sentimental considerations are touching, she said, her voice dripping with condescension, but they ignore market realities. Traditional development would yield higher returns with less complexity. Min-jae stepped forward then, and the room fell silent. Everyone present understood that this moment went beyond business. It was a son choosing between two legacies, two visions of success. His stepmother's expression sharpened, expecting him to defer to her judgment as he had so many times before. Instead, he turned to address the board directly. "My mother taught me that true value isn't always visible on a balance sheet," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. She believed that a community's worth lies in its people, its stories, its living heritage. This project honors that belief while creating sustainable economic growth. He proceeded to present detailed financial projections showing how Jaiwa's preservation-focused approach would generate long-term value through increased tourism, small business growth, and community engagement. The numbers were compelling, but it was his passionate defense of the project's soul that held the room's attention. The board members listened intently, their expressions thoughtful. Even Seo Hyun, who had been expected to critique the designs, nodded appreciatively at several of the innovative solutions. Minji's stepmother sat rigid in her chair, watching her influence over her stepson visibly crumble. As the presentation concluded, Mrs. Kim stepped forward with a surprise of her own. She unveiled a series of old photographs showing the neighborhood in its prime, including several of Minji's mother working tirelessly to protect it. "This project isn't just about buildings," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "It's about honoring those who came before us while creating something new for those who will follow." The success of the presentation was short-lived. As the board members filed out of the conference room, Minji's stepmother remained behind, her composure masking barely contained anger. She waited until the room had cleared except for Min-jae and Jaiwoo before speaking. "Did you really think I wouldn't investigate her?" she asked Min-jae, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Did you think I would let someone with her background influence our company's future?" She turned to Jaiwoo, her expression cold. "Your father's bankruptcy, the unpaid debts, the scandal that forced your family to move from Seoul. Did you think these things would stay hidden forever?" Jaiwoo felt the blood drain from her face. The threatened exposure she had feared from Hyunwoo had come from an unexpected direction. She watched Minji's expression, seeing confusion replace the confidence he had shown during the presentation. "Your father's company collapsed owing millions to its contractors," the stepmother continued, each word precise and cutting. "He disappeared for months, leaving others to bear the consequences. Is that the kind of family history we want associated with urban revival projects?" The silence that followed felt suffocating. Jaiwoo straightened her spine, finding strength in the truth. "My father made mistakes," she acknowledged, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But he spent years working to repay those debts. Every one I earned through part-time jobs during university went to making things right. We didn't hide, we rebuilt." She turned to Min-jae, whose face had become unreadable. "I should have told you earlier, but I wanted to be judged by my work, not my family's past." The stepmother pressed her advantage. "And what about your relationship with Min-jae? Was that part of rebuilding too? A calculated move to secure your position?" The accusation struck like a physical blow. Jaiwoo looked at Min-jae, hoping he would defend her, but saw only confusion and hurt in his eyes. The memory of their shared moments, the dinner at his mother's favorite restaurant, the quiet conversations, the growing trust, seemed to shatter in the face of his silence. "I need time to think," Min-jae finally said, his voice distant. He left the room without meeting Jaiwoo's eyes, leaving her alone with his stepmother's triumphant smile. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Jaiwoo threw herself into her work, refining designs and meeting with contractors, but Minji's absence felt like a physical ache. He had retreated into his office, communicating only through formal emails and staff meetings. The neighborhood residents noticed the change. Mrs. Kim found Jaiwoo working late one evening, surrounded by blueprints and trying to hide the evidence of tears. The elderly woman sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You know," Mrs. Kim said softly, Minji's mother faced similar judgment when she married his father. Her family had no status, no connections. The social circles she married into never let her forget it. Jaiwoo looked up, surprised. But Min-jae never mentioned. Because he was too young to understand then. But I remember how she fought to prove herself worthy, not of their approval, but of her own dreams. Mrs. Kim's eyes held a mixture of sadness and wisdom. Sometimes we must step back to let others fight their own battles with the past. Taking Mrs. Kim's advice to heart, Jaiwa made a difficult decision. She submitted a formal request for a leave of absence from the project, citing personal reasons. The distance felt necessary, not just for Min-jae to sort through his feelings, but for her to remember who she was beyond other people's judgments. That evening, as she packed up her office, she found herself face to face with Min-jae. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words and broken trust. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Taking some time," she corrected gently. "To give you space to decide what matters more, who I was then or who I am now." In her apartment, surrounded by boxes once again, Jaiwa found herself drawn to an old wooden chest she hadn't opened since moving to Busan. Inside, beneath photographs and childhood mementos, lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were from her mother, written during the difficult years after her father's bankruptcy, before illness took her too soon. One envelope caught her eye. It was dated differently than the others, marked, "Open when you find your purpose." With trembling fingers, Jaiwa broke the seal and unfolded the delicate paper. "My dearest daughter," the letter began, "if you're reading this, you've finally discovered what truly matters to you. I've watched you grow, seeing in you the same passion for creating spaces that bring people together that I once saw in my dearest friend, Sunhee. She understood, as I did, that true beauty lies in preserving the heart of a community." Jaiwa's breath caught. Sunhee, Minji's mother's name. She read on, her heart racing as the connection revealed itself through her mother's words. The letter told a story of two young women who had met in university, sharing dreams of architecture and community preservation. Sunhee had gone on to marry into the Park family, while Jaiwa's mother had married a small construction company owner. "We remained close," her mother wrote, "even as our lives took different paths. When your father's company struggled, Sunhee tried to help, but her husband's family opposed any association with us. The last time I saw her, she made me promise to keep our friendship secret to protect her son's future. But she also promised to watch over you, believing our children's paths might cross one day." The revelation struck Jaiwoo like a physical force. The cold attitude of Minji's stepmother wasn't just about class prejudice. It was about maintaining a separation that had begun years ago. Without thinking, Jaiwa grabbed the letter and her car keys. The drive to the project site was a blur. It was late evening, but she knew Min-jae would be in his office. He always worked late when troubled. She found him standing at the window, looking out over the neighborhood his mother had loved. When he turned at her entrance, she saw the same confusion and hurt in his eyes, but now she understood its deeper source. "Did you know?" she asked, holding out the letter. "Did you know our mothers were friends?" Min-jae took the letter, his expression shifting from confusion to shock as he read. "This can't be." But his voice trailed off as he reached for something on his desk, an old photograph she hadn't noticed before. In it, two young women smiled at the camera, arms linked, standing in front of a building site. "I found this in my mother's things," he said quietly. "I never knew who the other woman was. My stepmother said all my mother's old photos should be packed away, that dwelling on the past wasn't healthy." She knew, Jaiwa realized. Your stepmother knew about our family's connection. That's why she was so opposed to my involvement in the project. She wasn't just worried about my family's past, she was afraid the truth would come out. Min-jae sank into his chair, the photograph trembling in his hands. "All this time," he whispered, "I thought I was honoring my mother's memory by following my stepmother's guidance. But I was letting her erase the very connections my mother valued most." Mrs. Kim's voice interrupted them. She stood in the doorway, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've waited years for this moment," she said. "Sunhee made me SE to watch over both of you, to wait until the time was right. When Jaiwa first presented her designs, I saw Sunhee's spirit in her work. I knew then that fate had brought you together." The next morning, at a hastily convened board meeting, Min-jae stood before the directors with a new sense of purpose. Jaiwa sat in the front row, her mother's letter safely tucked in her pocket. "This project has always been about more than business," Min-jae began. "It's about honoring connections between past and present, between people and places, between hearts that understand the true meaning of community." He glanced at his stepmother, who sat rigid with barely contained anger. "Some tried to sever these connections, thinking they were protecting me, but in doing so, they dishonored the very legacy they claimed to preserve." The story poured out, of two mothers who shared a vision, of children brought together by fate to fulfill that vision, of a love story that bridged generations. When Min-jae finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. In the end, it wasn't the financial projections or the innovative designs that won the board's complete support. It was the understanding that some connections are meant to be, that some stories come full circle in ways we never expect. The neighborhood's revitalization project moved forward, now infused with an even deeper sense of purpose. And in Mrs. Kim's tea shop, two photographs sat side by side, one of two young women dreaming of building communities and another of their children, together, making those dreams come true.